Imagine you're a 17-year-old student, just selected to join a prestigious aviation program, a rare opportunity you've dreamed about your entire childhood. You're standing in the pilot lounge at Westbridge Airport, heart racing, looking around the room you once thought was only for grown-ups. When suddenly, a sharp voice cuts through the air. "You're not allowed in here. Who let you in?" In just moments, your joy turns into a nightmare. A veteran pilot, cold and unflinching, calls you an intruder. She doesn't ask why you're here. She doesn't check the facts. She just sees you, your skin, and makes her judgment. No one speaks up. No one questions what's really happening. And you stand there, alone, until the phone in your hand becomes your final lifeline. You call your father. What you don't know is that moment will change everything. This isn't just a story about a teenager being wrongly accused. It's a story about dignity stripped and reclaimed, about prejudice and a powerful, poised resistance, and above all, about a dream nearly crushed, but ultimately lifted to soar higher than ever before. Join us in the story of Malik Thompson, where an unjust accusation collides with justice and a father's love to remind us every dream deserves to be protected. Morning at Westbridge International Airport. Sunlight streamed through thick glass, casting long shadows on the polished stone floor of the pilot lounge. Malik Thompson sat quietly on a bench, clutching his small backpack, his eyes fixed on the TV screen playing a documentary about the history of aviation. At 17, Malik was not like most teenagers. He wasn't wearing headphones or scrolling through his phone. Instead, he listened intently to the narration about Boeing and Airbus aircraft as if it were his favorite classical symphony. Pinned to his chest was a plastic name badge clearly printed with Malik Thompson, Horizon Youth Flight Initiative, Guest Access, Pilot's Lounge. It wasn't just an entry pass, it was the result of months of hard work, essays, application forms, and late nights preparing for a competitive experiential training program for aspiring young aviators, a rare opportunity reserved for only the most exceptional students. But not everyone in the pilot lounge looked at that badge with recognition. The door swung open, and a woman in a crisp pilot uniform stepped in, her polished black shoes clicking sharply against the floor. On her epaulets were 4 gold stripes, mark of a senior captain. Charlotte Hayes, longtime captain for Aurora Sky Airlines, entered the room like she owned every square inch of it. In a split second, her eyes locked on Malik, the only black teen in a room traditionally reserved for those with authority. Charlotte narrowed her eyes. There was no curiosity in her expression, only suspicion. A judgment had already been made before a word was spoken. "You there!" Charlotte's voice cut through the quiet, cold and sharp like a blade. "Who gave you permission to be here?" Malik startled slightly but stood up quickly, keeping his tone calm and respectful. "Ma'am, my name is Malik Thompson. I was invited to join the Horizon program. Ms. Ava Robinson from the training team showed me to this room. She said I could wait here." Charlotte walked closer, glaring at Malik's name badge before letting out a dry, scoffing laugh. "Horizon, huh?" She raised an eyebrow, her tone dripping with condescension. "Never heard of letting children play around in the pilot lounge. This isn't a classroom, and it's definitely not a place for daydreaming." Malik kept his voice steady, though his hands clenched tighter. "I'm not here to play, ma'am. This is a serious educational opportunity. I'm just waiting quietly." But she didn't let him finish. With a swift motion, Charlotte snatched the badge from Malik's chest, flipping it back and forth as if examining a forged document. Then she turned to him, eyes cold, lips pressed into a tight line. "I don't believe this is real. A black kid wandering into a restricted area with a plastic badge like this? Absurd." She reached for her radio, pressing the button with force. "Security post, we've got an unauthorized intruder in the pilot lounge. Respond immediately." Malik stood frozen. It felt like the entire room had morphed into a courtroom, and he was the lone defendant. Eyes began to turn his way, curious, skeptical, and a few openly filled with disdain. He didn't shout, he didn't lash out, but inside, a storm had begun to rise. Not because he felt insulted, but because the dream he had spent years nurturing might now be erased, simply because of the color of his skin. Amid hurried footsteps and whispers quietly rippling through the pilot lounge like an invisible wave, Malik stood silently, his eyes distant. But deep within him, a stream of memories slowly began to rise like a headwind resisting the invisible pressure crushing his chest. Malik was not just a random teenager who happened to be in the pilot lounge. His journey had begun years ago on a blazing summer afternoon when he was just 7 years old. It was the first time his father took him to an air show in the state of Georgia, a place where rescue helicopters, military aircraft, and commercial Boeings gleamed proudly under the sun. While other kids his age were captivated by flight simulators, Malik spent hours standing next to an old jet, eyes fixed on the intricate controls inside the cockpit. "Dad," he had once asked, "how does a pilot know where they are in the sky when it's so big?" His father, Victor Thompson, the current director of the Civil Aviation Authority, CAA, smiled patiently. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he knelt down, pointed to the radar display on a flight map, and carefully explained the concepts of coordinates, air traffic control, and navigation signals. In Victor's eyes, his son wasn't just a curious child, he was a seed of potential, waiting to take root and grow. From that day on, Malik stepped into the world of the skies like a disciple of the light. He spent all his free time researching, reading, and watching documentaries on aviation. Every night, while the city slept, the glow of his computer monitor still lit up his room, his face absorbed in a flight simulator, learning how to land during a thunderstorm, troubleshoot engine failure, or master complex avionics like a real pilot. In school science fairs, Malik always stood out with projects about aerospace engineering and navigation technology. He could sketch the layout of a commercial aircraft cockpit with near-perfect accuracy, a talent that left teachers and judges in awe. But Malik never saw those as personal achievements. To him, they were just small steps along the long road to his dream, becoming a pilot not for the glory, but for the desire to command the skies with equality, fairness, and freedom. So when he heard about the Horizon Youth Flight Initiative, a hands-on program co-sponsored by Aurora Sky Airlines and the CAA, Malik spent several sleepless nights crafting his essay. He didn't just write with logic, he wrote from the heart. He wrote about memories with his father, about his room filled with airplane models, about nights spent glued to an old simulator. And at the end of his essay, he wrote just one sentence: "If the sky is meant for everyone, please let me prove it." No one in that room knew any of this. No one saw the calloused hands from years of gripping a flight controller. They only saw a black boy sitting in a room that seemed too big for what they thought he deserved. But even in the moment of being dismissed, Malik did not crumble. His father had taught him, no one can take your dream away unless you allow them to. And Malik knew this wouldn't be the first time, and certainly not the last time. He'd have to prove he belonged. Less than 10 minutes after entering, Captain Charlotte Hayes stood in the center of the pilot lounge as if she had just discovered an emergency threat. She gripped the radio tightly in her hand, her sharp voice cutting through the quiet room. "There's an unidentified black male trespassing in a restricted area. Send someone immediately. I repeat, we have a suspicious individual in the pilot lounge." Malik Thompson froze. He was still standing in the same spot, his ID badge clearly displayed on his chest, hands resting calmly at his sides, but his eyes now brimmed with confusion and disbelief. Charlotte's words had turned him from a student participating in a career orientation program into an intruder, a perceived threat that needed to be controlled. "Ma'am," Malik spoke up, his voice trembling but still measured, "I'm not trespassing. I'm a participant in the Horizon Youth Flight Initiative. Ms. Tanya Reynolds from the HR department personally brought me here. She told me to wait for her in this room." Charlotte stepped forward, closing the distance as if to assert her authority. "You think a badge and a few convenient excuses are enough to cover up unauthorized access?" she snapped, eyes locked onto him. The entire room fell into an icy silence. A few people peeked in from the hallway, curious but silent. No one questioned what was happening. No one intervened. They looked at Malik as if he were a problem without a solution, and their silence was the default answer. He didn't belong. Malik's heart pounded, but he stood tall. In his mind, his father's voice played like a mantra. "No matter what happens, never let anyone take your dignity." "I haven't done anything wrong," Malik said firmly, once again offering his badge for Charlotte to inspect. "My name is Malik Thompson. I arrived on time, followed the instructions. You can call Ms. Tanya if you need to verify." Charlotte didn't even glance at the badge. She raised the radio to her mouth and spoke sharply. "Emergency situation in the pilot lounge. Requesting immediate security response." Malik swallowed hard. The sense of isolation began to tighten around his chest. Every gaze around him carried suspicion, hesitation, or worse, indifference. No one asked what he needed. No one asked what the truth was. He was simply a shadow, and that shadow had already been defined by his skin color and his age. Footsteps echoed from the end of the hallway. Two airport security officers arrived, their postures stiff and professional. They turned to Charlotte, who pointed directly at Malik. "There, that's him. Check immediately. He may have used a fake badge to access this restricted area." One of the officers, the taller of the two, approached Malik cautiously. "Young man, please hand over your ID and any credentials. We need to verify them." Malik reached into his wallet, his hand trembling slightly, but his voice remained steady. "May I call my father? He works with the Federal Aviation Administration. He can confirm everything." Charlotte let out a cold laugh. "Everyone says their dad has some big job. My job is to make sure no one exploits loopholes to get in." One sentence, one mocking smile. And Malik realized what he was facing wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a fully formed bias, cloaked in procedure, carrying the cold shadow of discrimination. Yet even as he stood surrounded by doubt and insult, Malik held his head high. He didn't yell, he didn't panic, because Malik knew if he lost his composure, his voice would no longer be heard. And in that moment, all he wished for was that his father, the man who taught him what dignity truly means, would arrive in time to prove that his dream was not a crime. In the suffocating atmosphere of the pilot lounge, where every gaze clung to him like a silent indictment, Malik stood still. His hands tightened slightly, fingers trembling unconsciously. His legs felt as if they were sinking into the cold tile floor. But then, amidst the quiet surge of panic running through him like a silent current, an image flashed in his mind, the face of his father, Mr. Victor Thompson. Malik closed his eyes for a brief moment in the storm of prejudice. And in that darkness, memory lit up like a lighthouse. The first time he ever entered an airport was when he was 8. His father, who had just been appointed executive director of the Civil Aviation Authority, held little Malik's hand as they walked through the wide corridors of Midway Airport. Malik still remembered the awe he felt standing before a Boeing 737 parked quietly under the sunlight. His young eyes couldn't look away from its majestic form, like a giant iron bird carrying dreams beyond the ground. "They call this a runway," his father said, standing beside him. "See, it's not for running away. It's for taking off." Young Malik had only nodded then, his eyes following every aircraft wing gliding past like fragments of hope against the blue sky. And in the years that followed, whenever he grew tired, discouraged by whispers or doubting stares from those who didn't believe he deserved the dream of becoming a pilot, his father was always the first to stand by him. He didn't speak much, but every word seemed etched into Malik's being. "Malik, you don't need to shout to prove your worth. You just need to stand tall. A dream is real if you believe in it long enough and hold on tight enough. You might be the only one like you in the room, but you are never alone if you remember who you are." And today, in a room flooded with suspicion, those very words were what kept him upright. Malik opened his eyes. Charlotte Hayes was still in front of him, her gaze sharp as steel. To his left stood the two security officers still waiting for instruction. Around him, people were still murmuring. But within him now, there was something stronger conviction. He didn't yell. He didn't cry, though his throat was tight, because Malik understood. If he broke into tears now, every gaze would say, "See, he's weak. He can't control his emotions." If he got angry, they'd whisper, "Just like we thought, he's dangerous." So he chose silent strength. He pulled out his phone, hands still slightly shaking, but his eyes no longer frantic. He scrolled to the familiar name in his contacts and pressed call as if that button was a restart switch for the trust that had been eroded by unjust accusations. "Dad," Malik whispered as the dial tone rang. "I need you." It was a quiet statement, but it was a call from deep within the heart of a 17-year-old boy pushed to the edge, still holding on to the belief that truth, if understood in time, can save someone from the brink. And in that moment, deep in Malik's heart, only one thing remained: the unwavering belief that his father would not let his son's dream be suffocated by prejudice. The phone rang in Malik's hand, each chime stretching into eternity, crashing against the heavy silence of the pilot lounge. Every sound felt like a taut string wrapping around his heart. He didn't know if the person on the other end would answer in time, and if they did, whether anything could still be salvaged. "Dad." Malik's voice cracked as the call connected, like a child lost in a dream turned nightmare. "Malik?" Victor Thompson's voice came through deep, steady. "What's going on? Are you okay?" Hearing that familiar voice, Malik felt as if a weight had been lifted from his chest. He tried to hold back tears, tried to stay calm, but the fear buried beneath every word still seeped through. I'm being stopped at the pilot lounge. They said my pass is fake. They don't believe me, Dad. I did everything right, but they won't listen. I don't know what to do." There was a pause on the other end just a second, but for Malik, it felt like a century. Then Victor spoke, no panic, no anger, just the sharp, steady calm of a father who's seen injustice more times than he can count. "Listen to me, Malik. Take a deep breath. You haven't done anything wrong. You are being exactly who you are, brave and composed. I'm coming there right now. You are not alone, and you are not the one at fault here. Just hold on until I get there. One sentence, one promise." But in that moment, to Malik, it was a lifeline thrown just before he could fall into the abyss. He took a long, deep breath as if surfacing from icy water and nodded, though his father couldn't see it. "Okay, Dad." His voice still trembled, but there was something firmer underneath now. He hung up and gripped the phone tightly, as if it wasn't just a device but a talisman his father had just handed him. He looked around. Charlotte Hayes still stood there, her face twisted with irritation that he hadn't broken down. The security officers looked increasingly impatient. The room felt like it was waiting for a conclusion, a collapse, an outburst, or a confession. But Malik gave them none of it, because now his heart wasn't filled entirely with fear. Something else was beginning to rise, not blind hope, but a grounded belief. My father is coming, and he won't let this end in injustice. Still, even with that promise of protection, Malik understood exactly where he stood in a narrow space between a dream he had nurtured since childhood and a nightmare ready to devour it with a single accusation. A boundary where just one mistake, one poor decision from the adults around him, could undo everything he had worked for, leaving nothing behind. Malik took another deep breath. His gaze had shifted, no longer despairing, but not yet at peace. It was the look of someone holding on to a promise to his father, to himself, that he would stand tall, at least until the truth had a chance to be heard. He sat upright in the chair, phone still clenched in his hand, trying to keep his breathing steady just as his father had told him. But it was hard. Charlotte Hayes stood near the door, her gaze still cold as steel. In the thick silence of the room, her voice rang out again, but this time, it wasn't a question. It was an accusation. "I know your type," she said, her voice low but echoing with a weight that seemed to reverberate through the entire room. "Sneaking into pilot areas, carrying fake passes, sitting still like you're studying the room. Who's to say you're not some kind of industrial spy?" Each word hit Malik like a needle, stabbing straight into his dignity. His chest tightened. He had never imagined a day would come when someone would call him a spy, just because he loved the skies. Just because he was in the right place at the right time with the right documents but with the wrong skin color. Charlotte didn't stop. Her voice grew sharper, this time aiming directly at his roots. "Maybe your parents work janitorial here? Or maybe you live so close to the airport that you thought you could sneak into this world with a few papers and a polite smile? I'm sorry, Malik, but this is not the place to test your luck. This is a world for the trained, not a fantasy land for black boys with dreams." That line landed like a punch straight to Malik's heart, not because of the insult to him, but because of the blow aimed at his parents. His father, a man who had dedicated his entire life to aviation, whom Malik proudly called his silent hero, was now being reduced to a janitor, just to feed someone's poisonous sarcasm. No one in the room said a word. Some looked down. Others glanced at Malik with caution, or quietly shook their heads as if to distance themselves from the trouble. Just minutes earlier, he was a standout student, an honored guest of the Horizon Youth Flight Initiative. Now, with only a few cruel sentences, he had been transformed into a suspect in the eyes of everyone present. But Malik didn't stand. He didn't shout. He didn't cry. He simply closed his eyes with one deep breath as if to remind himself, "Dad is coming, and Dad won't let me fall." He thought of the car ride that morning when the two of them had laughed together on the way to the airport. Of the way his father had said, "There might be people who doubt you, but don't you ever doubt yourself." Those memories were now the only armor Malik had left to wear, standing in the middle of a battlefield of bias and complicit silence. Outside the room, the shuffle of footsteps, the distant announcements over the airport speakers echoed faintly. But inside, Malik was still surrounded by silent stares, whispered assumptions, and the coldness radiating from one person, the one who should have known the meaning of principle and fairness. And still, Malik waited. Though his throat was dry and his limbs cold, he sat there like a blade of grass in a rising storm, unbent, unbowed, because he knew a light had appeared, even if faint, a promise from his father, and the belief that the truth would not stay buried forever. The glass door leading into the pilot lounge swung open. The sound wasn't loud, but it rang like thunder in the room weighed down by tension. Everyone instinctively turned, and then the entire room seemed to freeze. Victor Thompson stepped in. In a neatly tailored gray suit, tie perfectly knotted, silver-streaked hair smoothly combed, he didn't need to speak to command attention. He was the focal point from the very first second. Behind him were three men in black suits, each wearing the emblem of the Federal Civil Aviation Authority, FAA. No words were exchanged, but one glance at that insignia was enough for everyone to understand. Something serious was about to happen. Malik looked up, and when his eyes met his father's, every bottled-up emotion suddenly burst open in his chest. He stood, trembling slightly, and ran toward him. Victor said nothing, just opened his arms and pulled his son into a firm embrace, not loud, not dramatic, but powerful enough to block out any storm. "Are you okay?" Victor asked softly. Malik nodded, his eyes glistening. In that single moment, the father had brought back the boy teetering on the edge of despair, restoring him to who he truly was: a student, a dreamer of the skies, a person worthy of respect. Charlotte Hayes stood frozen. She no longer held the confident posture she had before. She couldn't. Her pale face barely masked the shock of seeing Victor, the man whose name she'd seen just that morning on the cover of an aviation magazine in the executive lounge. Victor Thompson, the man steering U.S. civil aviation into a new era. She stepped back as if to hide her panic, but it was too late. Everyone in the room, from airport staff to pilots to security guards, had begun whispering, the questions practically hanging in the air. "That's the boy's father? Is that really Victor Thompson?" Victor stepped forward, his gaze now cold and sharp as a blade. He didn't need to yell, didn't need to threaten. His mere presence was enough to make Charlotte feel small. "I am Victor Thompson," he said calmly, his voice crisp, precise, as though he were delivering testimony before Congress. "Executive Director of the Civil Aviation Authority, and the young man you just labeled an intruder is my son." A subtle shockwave rippled down the spines of everyone present. Malik now stood just behind his father, feeling the unwavering protection of the man he had always admired. But at the same time, he knew his father wasn't just here to defend him. He had come to confront a deeper truth. "Ms. Hayes," Victor turned to Charlotte, his voice steady but edged with disappointment. "Do you understand what you've done? You turned a 17-year-old student, officially enrolled in a federally approved training program, into a suspect simply because he didn't look like someone you believe belongs here." Charlotte opened her mouth, but no words came out. Facing the head of the entire national aviation safety system, she could only lower her head. Victor turned to the nearby security officers. "Which of you checked my son's credentials?" One of the two men answered meekly, "Sir, the badge is still with Ms. Hayes." Victor looked back at Charlotte, his eyes now sharp as a steel blade. "I will be requesting a full report on this incident, and I will also recommend a comprehensive review of this airport's student intake and access protocols." A beat passed. Then he placed his hand gently but firmly on Malik's shoulder. "You did well, Malik. Holding your dignity, that's what I'm most proud of." And in that moment, the eyes that had once looked at Malik with suspicion began to shift. And for Malik, though the sting of wrongful accusation still lingered, he now understood. Silence is not the end. Sometimes, all it takes is one person walking in at the right moment, and the entire game has to change. After the moment Victor Thompson stated his identity and authority, the atmosphere in the pilot lounge froze completely. Everyone's eyes followed him, the man who had just entered like a whirlwind, completely overturning the power dynamic that Charlotte Hayes thought she controlled. Victor calmly turned to the older security officer, who was holding a tablet, his expression a mix of unease and concern. "Can you help me retrieve the surveillance footage from this area between 12:45 and 1:15 p.m.? Victor's voice wasn't loud, but carried a weight that made the entire room fall silent as if awaiting a verdict. The officer nodded and swiftly began to work. Within minutes, the main screen in the lounge was connected. The pale light from the security video washed over the faces of everyone watching, and as the footage began to play, every accusation Hayes had made started to crumble. On screen, the security camera clearly showed Malik entering the pilot lounge not alone. He was accompanied by Tanya Reynolds, a human resources staff member from Horizon Airlines, wearing a clearly marked uniform. She led him through the security checkpoint, scanned her badge at the gate, then gestured toward the row of seats near the window, the very spot where he had been sitting. Reynolds even bent down to hand him the special access badge, which matched exactly the one Hayes had ripped from his chest. Every moment was captured frame by frame without a single detail missing. When the video ended, no one spoke. Those who had been whispering and doubting moments earlier now lowered their heads in silence. Charlotte Hayes stood frozen, lips pressed together, eyes fixed on the floor. Victor looked around the room, then spoke slowly. "I believe the video has sufficiently confirmed the legitimacy of my son's presence here. The next question is, why was a legally escorted student treated like a security threat?" No one responded, but Victor wasn't finished. He gestured toward one of the CAA aides who had entered with him. The aide stepped forward, holding a folder. "This is a report from the Office of Ethics and Compliance at the CAA," Victor explained. "It documents 3 formal complaints regarding discriminatory behavior by Ms. Charlotte Hayes over the past 3 years, all involving passengers or colleagues of color." A wave of shock rippled through the room. Several staff exchanged looks, not surprised, but as if they had long suspected something and never imagined the truth would be revealed so publicly. Victor opened the file and read aloud, each line crisp and unflinching. Case 1, June last year. A Latinx trainee was denied access to the training facility by Hayes because he didn't look like a pilot. Case 2, an African-American maintenance worker was publicly reprimanded for looking untrustworthy. Case 3, an Asian passenger was subjected to extra screening without just cause. And now, Case 4, my son, Malik. There was nothing left to deny. Every eye in the room now turned to Hayes as if staring at a crack that could no longer be hidden. Charlotte stood motionless, her face pale, her jaw clenched, seemingly holding back tears not out of remorse, but from the collapse of her now exposed reputation. Victor didn't need to say more. The truth had spoken. And the once thunderous accusations now stood revealed as baseless, stripped bare under the transparent light of evidence. Malik stood quietly behind his father, not smug, not triumphant, but within him something was unmistakably clear. Truth doesn't need to scream. It only needs time and someone brave enough to demand justice. After the video ended and the evidence was read aloud, each word clear and deliberate, the atmosphere inside the pilot lounge at Westbridge Airport grew thick, like everyone was breathing in the heavy silence of a collective shock. No one had the courage to say anything. No one could claim they didn't know, didn't hear, or didn't see. Charlotte Hayes, who had walked into this room with her usual cold and arrogant demeanor, now stood frozen. Her once piercing gaze was gone, replaced by a confused expression barely masked by the tension on her face. Her posture, once a symbol of authority, now slumped slightly, like the pride within her was starting to crack. Victor Thompson scanned the room, pausing briefly on each bowed head before fixing his gaze squarely on Hayes. His voice remained calm, but every word struck like a hammer hitting the stone wall of silence. "By the authority vested in me as Director of the Civil Aviation Authority, CAA, I hereby suspend Captain Charlotte Hayes from duty, effective immediately." The room fell utterly silent, not a murmur, not even the sound of a sharp breath. Everyone present understood they were witnessing a moment unprecedented in the history of Westbridge Airport, a public disciplinary action, in broad daylight, at the very center of aviation authority. Victor continued, his voice both firm and full of accountability. "A full investigation will be launched not only regarding today's incident, but also concerning previous complaints that were overlooked. We will review selection processes, behavioral oversight, and transparency within this command structure. No one, regardless of rank or seniority, has the right to weaponize bias to humiliate another person." Hayes didn't protest. There were no excuses left. Her shoulders slumped. Her eyes no longer searched for justification. Her reputation, her career, and the trust of colleagues who once respected her had peeled away like flaking paint under the light of truth. Victor turned to his son. Malik still stood there, eyes wide, trying to keep his face steady beneath the weight of so many emotions. He didn't cry, but his entire body trembled, not out of fear, but because justice had finally chosen his side. At that moment, a representative from the airport's internal communications team stepped forward, speaking clearly and confidently. "On behalf of the Executive Board of Westbridge International Airport, we issue a formal public apology to Malik Thompson for the harm he endured due to the serious misconduct of a member of our staff. His dignity was violated, and we commit to fully restoring his reputation and rights." The entire room stilled. Words like public apology and restoration of dignity were rarely spoken in this strict and hierarchical environment. But today, they rang out genuine, necessary, and perfectly timed. A few older pilots nodded, as if waking up from a long silence. A young female staff member gently placed her hand on Malik's shoulder, saying nothing, but her eyes were filled with understanding. Malik bowed his head slightly in acknowledgement. Not a hurried forgiveness, but an acceptance. An acceptance that his dream remained intact, despite everything. He still stood, head held high, in the very place that had tried to break him, and that was the greatest victory of the day. After the seemingly unbearable hours of tension, when justice had spoken and the truth was restored, Malik stood silently beside his father in the main terminal of Westbridge Airport. Everything around him seemed to slow down. The confused stares had shifted to respectful gazes. The silence was no longer judgment, it was acknowledgement. Something monumental had just happened, and no one could pretend otherwise. Just when it seemed like everything had come to a close, a calm, warm voice called from behind. "Malik Thompson?" He turned around. Standing before him was a woman in a pilot's uniform. 4 bright gold stripes shimmered on her shoulder epaulets under the dimming afternoon light. It was Captain Ava Robinson, one of Horizon Airlines' most experienced captains, and one of the few black women to have flown a Boeing 787 across continents. Ava smiled, her eyes filled with quiet confidence. "I followed your story, and I'd like to invite you to the cockpit of this afternoon's Dreamliner. Not as a passenger, but as a fellow aviator, someone who deserves to be here." Malik's eyes widened. He could hardly believe what he was hearing. For years, the cockpit had been the symbol of his most distant dream, a sacred space he had only dared to imagine through the flight simulator on his bedroom screen. And now, that door was opening. Not out of pity, but because he had earned it. His father, Victor Thompson, placed a firm hand on his son's shoulder and nodded a silent gesture of support. Malik followed Ava, his legs trembling slightly, but his eyes steadier than ever. When the cockpit door closed behind them, Ava pointed to the co-pilot's seat and said gently, "Do you know why I brought you here, Malik?" He shook his head honestly. "Because you've overcome what so many in this industry have silently endured, being dismissed. You didn't scream, you didn't lash out. You stood your ground and held on to your dignity. That's what makes you worthy of sitting here in the place where dreams take flight." Malik looked out through the glass panel in front of him. The runway stretched far below. In the distance, the sky expanded endlessly in every direction. His heart raced, not because the dream was too big, but because now it had never felt closer. In the months that followed, Malik's story spread rapidly across schools, aviation academies, and educational forums nationwide. He became the youngest ambassador for the Touch the Sky program launched by the Civil Aviation Authority, a new initiative spearheaded by Victor Thompson in the aftermath of the incident. Malik stood on stage before hundreds of black and minority students from rural areas who had never seen a plane outside of textbooks. His voice wasn't loud, but it was clear and heartfelt. "I once stood in a room full of doubt, but I didn't run. And that's what brought me here today. You can do it too. Because dreams don't belong to skin color, gender, or background. They belong to belief and courage. They say justice, even when delayed, is still justice." But for Malik, what he gained went far beyond vindication. It was the right to keep dreaming, to keep striving, and most importantly, to keep being himself. His father, Victor, didn't stop at one investigation. He launched a sweeping anti-discrimination campaign across the aviation industry, from training schools to executive offices. Every seminar bore a banner with a simple yet powerful slogan: "Every dream deserves protection. And if you've ever felt like you didn't belong, don't give up too quickly." Remember, sometimes all it takes is one person brave enough to stand firm against prejudice to change the entire sky. Are you ready to be that person? Malik didn't just get vindicated. He didn't just reclaim his name tag, his dignity, or the right to stand in the pilot's lounge. He reclaimed his faith in himself, in those willing to stand up for what's right, and in a future where doors are no longer closed because of skin color or background. From a teenager publicly humiliated and misunderstood, Malik stepped into the cockpit beside Captain Ava Robinson, a woman who had once overcome countless barriers, just like he had. And in that moment, amid the hum of the engines and the soft glow of the control panel, a dream once shattered took flight again. And the most important part? Malik didn't keep that story to himself. He shared it. He inspired others. He became a small flame lighting the way for countless young people still struggling to find their place in a world full of prejudice. Have you ever been underestimated just because you were different? Have you ever stayed silent, thinking your voice wasn't loud enough? Share your story in the comments. Because sometimes, all it takes is one person brave enough to speak up to change an entire system. If you believe every dream deserves protection, like this video, share it, and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next inspiring story. Because justice doesn't begin in a courtroom. It begins in the heart and in the courage of people like Malik and you. Thank you for watching. See you in the next story.